The heavy rain pounded the earth, turning the street into a blur of water and reflection. The world outside was a chaotic wash of gray, the kind of storm that made everything feel far too close. And then, there was the barking. The sound of Max, my loyal golden retriever, barking at nothing in particular, a distant car, the wind shaking the trees, or perhaps a shadow passing by. To me, it was just Max being Max. His barking was nothing more than the harmless noise of a dog trying to make sense of the world outside. But that noise, that familiar sound that had always filled the air of my home, suddenly cut off. The barks grew sharper, desperate, as if something had spooked him, something too close. And then, in the thick of the rain and the din of the storm, the barking was silenced. It wasn't just quiet, it was an oppressive, absolute silence that sent a chill through my spine. I turned, instinctively, towards the window, my heart pounding. The sharp crack of a gunshot pierced the quiet, shattering the stillness of the rain. It was so loud, so final, that for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Max's bark had stopped, but this was something else. I rushed to the door, the cold water splashing against my feet as I ran outside, my breath coming in frantic bursts. Through the rain-soaked yard, I saw him, Max, lying on the ground, his body still. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. He was my best friend, my companion, and now, he lay lifeless in the wet grass. Standing just a few feet away, almost casually, was Karen, the HOA president. The woman who had made my life hell since the moment I moved into this neighborhood. She stood there, looking down at Max, a twisted smirk tugging at her lips as she casually lowered the gun. "It was too much noise," she said, her voice chillingly calm, as though explaining the weather. "I had to do something about it." The words echoed in my ears, each one feeling like a punch. Karen, the woman who had always seen herself as the protector of this perfect, quiet neighborhood, had just crossed the line, permanently. She had killed my dog, and in her twisted mind, she thought it was justified. I could feel my fists clench, rage surging through me. But beneath it all, there was a deep, hollow feeling. Max was gone, and nothing would ever bring him back. Max had always been a good dog. Loyal, friendly, protective, and always eager to make his presence known. His barking was one of the most comforting sounds in my house, a reminder that everything was as it should be. Max was the kind of dog who took his job seriously, particularly when it came to guarding our home. If a car rolled by too slowly or a stranger dared to walk too close to the property, Max would bark. It was his way of protecting his family. His barks were loud, yes, but they were harmless. Max was simply doing what dogs do, alerting us to anything out of the ordinary. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't trying to scare anyone. He was just a dog, doing his job in the only way he knew how. But to Karen, my next-door neighbor and the neighborhood's HOA president, Max's barking was a nuisance. Karen had lived in this neighborhood for years and had taken it upon herself to enforce what she considered the standards of peace. Quiet was her religion. Karen had made it clear from the beginning that she didn't tolerate anything she deemed disruptive, especially when it came to noise. Max had been the first target in her quiet war on disorder. At first, it was small things, casual complaints dropped off in a note left at my door, with a polite but firm reminder to keep my dog quiet. I understood her frustration, to an extent. Max could be loud, and I had tried to manage it, bringing him inside when he got too vocal, walking him at quieter times of the day. But Karen was relentless. The complaints continued, escalating from a simple note to formal letters from the HOA, demanding that I take more action or face fines. Each letter seemed to come with more force, more threats, as if her small grievance with my dog had become her personal mission. I tried to talk to her once, to explain that Max was just doing his job, that he wasn't causing harm, just making noise. I told her that I was already doing what I could to control it. But Karen wouldn't listen. She was adamant that Max's barking was disturbing the peace of the entire neighborhood. She told me that if I didn't take more drastic action, she would involve the authorities. It was clear to me then that she wasn't just upset by the barking, she had a deep need to control everything around her, to impose her vision of order onto the neighborhood. The HOA, under her reign, became less about community and more about enforcing her personal rules. It wasn't just Max, it was anyone or anything that didn't fit into her narrow view of how things should be. Karen had started threatening legal action. She told me that if I didn't find a way to stop Max from barking altogether, she would take me to court. She said it was disrupting the peace and that I was violating the HOA's quiet hours rule, even though the rule didn't specifically apply to barking dogs. I wasn't sure how far she could really take it, but it was clear Karen had no intention of letting this go. I tried to be patient, to reason with her, but the threats kept coming. Every few days, there was a new letter, a new warning. At this point, I was already doing everything I could to control Max. I had hired a dog trainer, kept him indoors during the day, and walked him at times when I knew the neighborhood would be quieter. But nothing seemed to satisfy Karen. Her complaints continued to escalate. Each letter she sent me felt like an accusation, like I wasn't doing enough to control my own dog. It wasn't just about the barking anymore, it was about Karen asserting her dominance, about her need to be the arbiter of what was acceptable in this community. She wanted total control, and nothing, not even Max's innocent nature, was going to get in the way of that. Then, one evening, the situation reached its breaking point. It was raining heavily, the kind of downpour that made the world outside feel muffled and distant. Max was out in the yard, barking at a passing car, as he always did. His bark echoed in the storm, loud and insistent. It wasn't a rare occurrence, and for me, it was just part of life. But for Karen, it was one too many. I didn't hear her approach, but I saw her standing there in the yard, in the pouring rain, a strange calm in her demeanor. Before I could process what was happening, I heard the gunshot. It wasn't a sound I could ever prepare for. The crack of the rifle sliced through the heavy rain like a thunderclap. My blood ran cold as Max fell silent, his body collapsing onto the grass, motionless. Karen stood there, the rifle in her hands, looking down at Max with a cold, detached expression. She wasn't even shocked by what she had done. He was too much noise, she said, almost too casually, as if it were the most reasonable explanation in the world. He was disturbing the peace. It had to be done. I stood frozen, staring at the lifeless body of my dog, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Karen's words echoed in my mind, too much noise. That was it. A dog barking. A simple thing that Max had done every day of his life, and it had led to this. I looked at Karen, who still stood there, holding the rifle like it was just another tool in her arsenal, and something inside me snapped. I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. Anger surged through me, boiling over as I moved toward her. You shot him. You shot my dog for barking. My voice trembled with disbelief and rage. You can't just kill someone's pet because it's inconvenient for you. But Karen wasn't fazed. She didn't even flinch. It was necessary, she said, as though the situation were entirely justifiable. You should have controlled him better. He was too loud. He couldn't keep doing that. Someone had to stop him. Her calmness, her complete lack of remorse, sent a chill down my spine. The reality of what she had done started to settle in, and I realized just how far Karen would go to maintain her idea of peace. Max hadn't been a problem. He was simply a dog doing his job. But to Karen, his existence was an inconvenience, one that she had decided to end. Standing there, watching Max's still form in the rain, I knew this wasn't just about a barking dog. This was about something much bigger, Karen's desire for absolute control, and the lengths she was willing to go to ensure that her vision of peace was unchallenged. It wasn't just the barking that had driven her to shoot my dog, it was the power she felt she could exercise over me, over my family, and now, over my dog. And she had gone too far. Max had always been more than just a dog to me. He was my companion, my protector, and, in many ways, my closest friend. I adopted him when he was just a puppy from a shelter that was struggling to find homes for its animals. I remember the day I brought him home vividly, the way his tiny paws barely made a sound on the floor, the nervous look in his eyes as he explored his new space, and how he instantly bonded with me. It was as if he knew I needed him as much as he needed me. From that moment on, Max became my constant. He followed me everywhere, never straying far from my side. His loyalty was unwavering. He was the kind of dog who would protect me to his last breath, and I knew it. I could count on him for anything. Whether I was celebrating a big promotion at work or nursing a broken heart after a tough breakup, Max was always there, nuzzling my hand, licking my face, offering comfort in ways that only a dog can. In those early years, it was just the two of us. My life was unpredictable, constant moves for work, changes in friendships, and the usual ups and downs that life throws at you. But Max never left. He wasn't just a dog, he was my rock, the one thing I could count on through it all. The bond we shared grew deeper with time, and Max became an extension of myself. He learned my moods before I even knew what I was feeling, and I knew his. When he was happy, his tail wagged uncontrollably, and when he was anxious, he'd pace back and forth, watching me with those deep, soulful eyes. Max wasn't just loyal, though. He had a protective streak that was deeply ingrained in him. He had an innate sense of when things were off, when a person or situation wasn't quite right. Max wasn't the kind of dog who barked at every passing car or random noise. His bark was reserved for when he felt something was worth protecting. I remember one particular evening when I had a few friends over for dinner. Max had always been fine around people, but on that night, he acted strangely, circling the door and growling. One of my friends, Darren, who he had met countless times before, had arrived a little later. Max immediately stiffened, growled louder, and refused to leave the door. I chalked it up to a bad day, but when Darren left a little while later, Max calmed down, as if he knew that danger had passed. He was more than just a dog. He was a guardian, a sentry for the things that mattered most to me. Contrast Max with Karen, my neighbor, the HOA president, and the embodiment of control. Where Max was intuitive, calm, and protective, Karen was rigid, domineering, and judgmental. I had always found her behavior odd when I first moved into the neighborhood, but at the time, I thought nothing of it. I assumed she was just one of those overly enthusiastic neighborhood leaders who took everything a little too seriously. But as time went on, I began to realize how deeply ingrained Karen's need for control was. That was when Max became her focus. It started with a single complaint about Max barking too much. I had received an anonymous letter in my mailbox, the kind of letter that's polite on the surface but dripping with passive-aggressive undertones. The letter stated that my dog's barking during the day, especially when I wasn't home, was becoming a disturbance to Karen and the other residents. It was the first time I had even heard of anyone complaining. I didn't think much of it. Dogs bark, especially when they're trying to protect their territory. But Karen wouldn't let it go. She began to escalate her complaints. First, it was about Max barking too early in the morning. Then, it was about his constant barking throughout the day. I noticed that whenever I came home from work, Karen was watching me from her window. If Max barked even once when I stepped outside, she was at my door within the hour with a new complaint. I tried to reason with her, explaining that Max wasn't a nuisance, that he was just a dog being a dog. But Karen didn't see it that way. The next letter I received from her was an official warning from the HOA. It demanded that I take action to correct Max's barking behavior or face fines. I was stunned. It felt ridiculous. Max was just doing his job, and yet here was Karen, twisting the rules to her liking and turning something completely harmless into an issue that needed to be fixed. As the weeks went on, Karen became more aggressive. She would wait for Max to bark, then stand in her yard with a scowl, watching us like a hawk. Her complaints became more frequent, more direct. She threatened me with escalating fines if I didn't get Max to stop barking, even though I had already done everything in my power to control his behavior. Max was a good dog. He didn't deserve this. And yet, Karen was relentless, pushing me into a corner, trying to break me with her need for control. I had no idea that this petty annoyance would escalate into something so terrifying. But Karen had a knack for pushing people too far. She had a way of turning the smallest issues into personal crusades. And in her mind, Max was the perfect target. The barking, which had once been a harmless act of protection, was now something to be silenced, just like the people who refused to conform to Karen's vision of the perfect neighborhood. It wasn't about the barking anymore. It was about control, and Karen had no intention of stopping until she had it. I never imagined it would come to this, a gunshot in the rain, and the life of my dog, Max, taken because of one woman's need to control the world around her. Karen had crossed a line, and it was only then that I realized the full extent of her obsession with power. Max was more than just a dog, he was a symbol of my resistance, my refusal to let Karen win. And now, Karen had gone too far. She had to be stopped, for Max, for me, and for the community she had so ruthlessly controlled. The sound of Max's blood hitting the wet ground echoed in my ears as I rushed to his side. The rain pelted down in sheets, but I barely noticed the cold or the wetness. All I could see was Max, lying there, lifeless, his golden fur soaked in crimson. The sharp scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air as I knelt down beside him, my hands trembling as I tried to assess the damage. "Max?" I whispered, my voice breaking. My heart was racing, and I could feel the heat of panic rising in my chest as I pressed my hands to his side, hoping against hope that somehow, some miracle would make him come back. But it was too late. The blood continued to flow, staining the grass darker and darker, as I realized that the dog I had loved and trusted, who had always been by my side, was slipping away from me. Behind me, I could hear Karen's voice, so cold, so matter-of-fact, like she was explaining something trivial, as if what she had just done was just another mundane task to check off her list. "It was too much noise," she said, the words still ringing in my ears. "The barking. It had to stop." I spun around, furious, my body shaking with a mix of disbelief and rage. "Karen!" I shouted. "What the hell is wrong with you? You just shot my dog." Karen didn't even flinch at my outburst. She stood there, her hand still gripping the rifle, the look in her eyes as detached as ever. "He was disturbing the peace," she replied coldly, as though it were a perfectly reasonable explanation. "You don't control your dog, and this neighborhood deserves peace." I felt my blood boil. Karen wasn't even remorseful. She wasn't even sorry. She had just taken my dog's life like it was nothing. Like Max was nothing more than an inconvenience, and her twisted sense of order was more important than a life. The neighbors who had witnessed the shot or heard the gunfire began to gather, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Some were still processing what they had just seen, others were looking at Karen in horror. But as I turned to them, desperate for help, all I could see was the silence hanging between us. No one stepped forward. Karen, however, wasted no time in trying to cover up what she had done. "It was necessary," she said, her voice as smooth as ever. "You can't let an animal disturb the peace of an entire neighborhood." She turned to the group of neighbors, the same smug confidence in her voice as she addressed them, as if she were explaining a simple, everyday decision. "I was just trying to restore balance. I'm sure you all understand." The words were so ridiculous that I almost couldn't believe them. Karen was trying to make it seem like she had done me a favor, like she had solved a problem. But the problem wasn't Max's barking, it was her need to control everything, to destroy anything that didn't fit into her narrow, obsessive vision of what the neighborhood should be. And now, she had taken a life to enforce it. My dog's life. The anger surged through me, but I couldn't focus on that now. I had to focus on Max. I had to get him help, even though deep down, I knew it was too late. I scooped him up in my arms, holding him as gently as I could, trying to keep him from slipping away. "Please, Max," I whispered, feeling tears flood my eyes. "Stay with me." I ran as fast as I could through the rain, my heart racing in panic, but it was all in vain. Max was already gone. By the time I reached the vet's office, he was no longer breathing. The weight of his body in my arms was the heaviest thing I had ever carried. The grief overwhelmed me, and I couldn't stop shaking. Max was gone, and all I could do was hold him and say goodbye. My loyal companion, the one who had been with me through everything, was just gone. And it was Karen who had taken him. I couldn't even bring myself to go back and face her. Karen's cruel actions were a direct result of her control-freak nature, and I knew that her lack of remorse meant she would never take responsibility for what she had done. That night, when I returned home, the weight of what had happened started to sink in fully. Karen had gotten away with murder, and there was no way I could just let her continue to rule over this neighborhood like she had for years. The following days were a blur of legal consultations and sleepless nights. I had to get justice for Max. I couldn't just let Karen walk away without facing the consequences of her actions. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that Karen was well connected. She had allies in the HOA, and I knew that she would use everything in her power to cover her tracks and make me seem like the problem. I started talking to neighbors who had witnessed the shooting, hoping that they would support me in my quest for justice. Some of them, particularly those who had seen Karen with the gun in her hand, were willing to testify. But others hesitated. Karen had made sure to keep people on her side, and I could see the fear in their eyes. The ones who had been afraid of Karen before now had even more reason to stay quiet. She had power. She had control. And I realized that this wasn't just about the murder of my dog. It was about a system of fear and intimidation that had been in place for far too long. Karen had played this game for years. She knew how to manipulate, how to use her position to get away with anything. Now, she was using her influence to discredit me. She was telling everyone that Max had been a danger, that I was irresponsible, and that she had done the neighborhood a favor by getting rid of him. She was trying to turn the entire situation on its head, making herself out to be the hero. And I realized something even darker. Karen was trying to make Max's death seem justified. She had always believed that the world should bend to her will, and now, she was trying to bend the truth to her will too. The situation wasn't just about one dog being shot, it was about a battle for control, and Karen was still trying to win. The more I tried to expose her, the more I realized that I wasn't just fighting for Max's justice, I was fighting against a system of power and control that had poisoned the very fabric of this community. But I wasn't going to let Karen win. This wasn't just about my dog, it was about standing up to a bully who thought she could do whatever she wanted, with no consequences. I began to prepare for the next steps, knowing that the fight for Max's justice would be long. But Karen was not going to escape this. I would make sure of it. Max deserved justice, and I would fight for it, no matter what it took. The days following Max's death were filled with anger and confusion, but they also brought clarity. Karen's actions had set off a chain of events I wasn't ready for, but I knew I had to fight back, and I wasn't going to back down. The initial shock of Max's shooting began to wear off, replaced by a growing resolve. I wasn't just going to let Karen walk away from this. I wasn't going to let her get away with taking my dog's life and, worse, using her power to justify it. I began speaking to the neighbors who had witnessed the shooting, trying to piece together the story and gather evidence. The first few days were difficult. Some neighbors, especially those who had been present when the gunshot went off, were supportive. They spoke about the shock they felt and how they never expected Karen to escalate the situation like she did. Some even shared their own frustrations with her, how she'd been a source of tension in the neighborhood for years, always imposing her rules, and now, how she had gone too far. But then there were others, those who were still too afraid to speak up. Karen had always had a way of making people fear her. She didn't just hold power through her position as HOA president, she wielded it like a weapon. For years, she had manipulated and intimidated neighbors into silence, into compliance. The fear of Karen's retribution had kept many people in line, and despite the horror of what had happened, some were still reluctant to go against her. Even as I started gathering evidence, talking to more neighbors, taking photographs of the scene, and getting witness statements, it became clear that Karen wasn't going to let this go easily. She started spinning her version of events, telling anyone who would listen that Max had been a danger, that I hadn't been controlling him, and that she was simply protecting herself and the neighborhood. She tried to paint herself as the victim, the peacekeeper, the one who had acted out of necessity. I felt cornered. I had the truth on my side, but Karen had been getting away with her manipulative tactics for far too long. The more I exposed her actions, the more she fought back, turning everything I did into a battle. She had a way of twisting the truth to suit her narrative, and it was becoming clear that this wasn't just going to be a simple confrontation. She wasn't going to let Max's death go unpunished, at least, not by her. Then, Karen made her fatal mistake. In her arrogance, she tried to intimidate me into silence. One evening, she showed up at my door, standing there with that smug expression on her face, like she had all the power in the world. She wasn't there to apologize or show remorse. Instead, she tried to make me feel guilty, accusing me of making things worse and telling me that I was dragging this whole neighborhood into a legal mess. "If you keep pushing this, you'll ruin everything," Karen warned, her voice low and threatening. "You'll lose, and everyone will suffer for it. Think about your reputation, your future here." But she didn't realize that it wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about standing up for Max, standing up for what was right. I wasn't scared of her anymore. "Karen, this isn't about me or my reputation," I shot back, my voice steady with the conviction I had been holding inside me. "This is about what you did to Max. And you're going to pay for it. You can't control this anymore." For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. I knew I had her. The power Karen had held over the neighborhood for so long was beginning to unravel. But that didn't mean she was done. Karen wasn't just going to sit back and let me take her down. She escalated the situation further, filing legal papers accusing me of defamation and slander for telling the truth about her shooting Max. She claimed that Max had been a threat to her peace and that my actions were damaging her reputation. The legal battle had begun. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't just going to lose her grip on the neighborhood without putting up a fight, and I could see how determined she was to make me the villain in this story. But as I stood there, facing her empty threats and false accusations, I realized that this wasn't just about Max's death, it was about fighting for truth, for justice, and for every person who had ever been intimidated by Karen. She had created a culture of fear, but now, it was my turn to stand up, to show her that her time was up. The legal proceedings were slow, and the pressure mounted. Karen used her connections to delay the process, but every day that passed, I knew we were getting closer to the truth. And the closer we got, the more Karen started to feel the walls closing in on her. Her power was slipping away, and she knew it. It was no longer just about Max. It was about Karen's manipulation, her abuse of power, and the fact that she thought she could get away with anything. The more she fought back, the more I knew I had to keep pushing forward. I couldn't stop now, not when Max's memory was at stake, and certainly not when Karen had shown just how far she was willing to go to destroy anyone who got in her way. With every new piece of evidence, with every conversation I had with the neighbors who had witnessed her cruelty, I knew that Karen was running out of options. The truth was starting to find its way to the surface, and Karen was running out of ways to bury it. This wasn't just a fight for justice for Max anymore, it was a fight to bring down a tyrant who had terrorized a whole neighborhood for far too long. The tension was palpable as I entered the HOA meeting room. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could hear the murmurs of neighbors who had shown up to witness the confrontation. Some still wore the weight of fear in their eyes, but there were others, those who had begun to see the truth about Karen, who stood with quiet resolve. The room was filled with people who had been living under the thumb of Karen for too long, and now, finally, the truth was about to be revealed. I could see her sitting at the front, smug and confident, as usual. She was prepared, no doubt. Karen had always known how to manipulate a situation to her advantage. She had always been in control. But today, that was about to change. Today, Karen would face the consequences of her actions. The meeting began, the usual formalities followed, but my focus was on Karen. I had all the evidence, photos of Max's lifeless body, witness statements, and the records that outlined her history of manipulation, control, and abuse of power. I had been building my case for weeks, and now, it was time to put it all together. I stood up, my heart racing, but my voice steady. "I'm here today to speak the truth," I said, addressing the board and the crowd. The truth about what happened to Max and the truth about Karen's actions. The room fell silent, and Karen's smug smile faltered for the briefest of moments, though she quickly recovered. She glanced at the board members, and I could see her trying to regain control, trying to figure out how to spin this in her favor. "I have gathered all the evidence," I continued, feeling the weight of every word. "I have spoken to the witnesses who saw Karen shoot my dog. I have photos, I have statements, and I have proof that she has been manipulating this entire neighborhood for years." I paused, letting the words sink in, knowing the power they held. Karen's expression hardened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she sat back, crossing her arms, as if daring me to say anything more. "I'm not here to talk about Max's barking," I said. "That's a distraction. Max didn't deserve to die for being a dog. He was a protector, a companion." But Karen, in her quest to control everything and everyone around her, decided that his life wasn't worth anything. I could feel the weight of the room's attention shift. Some of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, realizing they couldn't stay silent any longer. I held up the photos of Max lying in the yard, the blood staining the grass beneath him. "This is what happens when someone like Karen gets too much power. This is what happens when you let a bully take control." I saw Karen stiffen in her seat, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Her usual confidence had been replaced by a barely concealed sense of panic. She opened her mouth, trying to deflect the accusation. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice quivering slightly despite her attempt to sound authoritative. "I was simply protecting myself. Max was out of control. I had every right to defend my property. I didn't let her words shake me. You shot him, Karen. You shot him because his barking was too much noise. You used your position as HOA president to manipulate the system, to get what you wanted, and now you're trying to justify murder." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, and I could see more neighbors starting to speak up. Tom, a neighbor who had always been too afraid to challenge Karen, stood up. "She's right. I've seen it. Karen has been making threats for months. It wasn't just about the dog. She's been controlling everything, and now she's gone too far." Other voices joined in, one by one, as more neighbors spoke out, recalling their own experiences with Karen, the unfair fines, the demands for perfection, and the way she bullied people into submission. The truth was spilling out like water breaking through a dam, and Karen could do nothing to stop it. She stood up abruptly, trying to regain control, but the board members were already looking at her differently. "This is outrageous," Karen shouted, her voice rising in anger. "These people are lying. I did what was necessary for the good of the neighborhood. This is defamation." But the evidence was irrefutable. I presented the witness statements, several of which had already been submitted to the authorities, and the photos of Max's death. I could see Karen's grip on the room loosening. The board members exchanged glances, some of them finally seeing through her manipulation. Her power was crumbling before her eyes. One of the board members, Linda, who had always been too afraid of Karen to speak up, stood up. "I've known Karen for years, but I can't ignore this. The truth is clear. Karen has used her power for far too long to control this neighborhood. She used it to take a life. I can't stand by and let her get away with this. The room was now fully behind me. Neighbors who had once been silent were speaking out. Karen's reign of terror was over. The final blow came when the board voted, unanimously, to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. It was official. Karen was no longer in control. Karen's face contorted with rage as she tried to argue, but the decision had been made. The power she had used to manipulate and divide the neighborhood was no longer hers to wield. "Your actions are inexcusable, Karen," one of the board members said. "We will be reporting this to the authorities. You will face the consequences of your actions." The weight of the words hung in the air as the room erupted into murmurs of disbelief and relief. Karen was removed from the HOA, and the community began to rebuild, piece by piece. She was no longer in control, and the truth had finally come to light. As the meeting concluded and Karen was escorted out, I couldn't help but feel a mix of exhaustion and relief. The fight had been long, but it had been worth it. Max's death, as painful as it was, had led to the exposure of Karen's true nature. She had tried to break us, but instead, we had broken free. In that moment, as I walked out of the meeting room, I knew we had won. Karen had faced the consequences of her violence, and the neighborhood, though scarred, was beginning to heal. The truth had prevailed. And Max, in his death, had sparked a change that could never be undone. The weeks that followed Karen's removal from the HOA presidency felt like a slow breath of fresh air after a long period of suffocation. The weight that had been hanging over the neighborhood for so long began to lift, and people started to come together. The community that had once been divided by fear of Karen's dominance was now beginning to find its voice again. No longer were neighbors afraid to speak up. No longer did they cower under the oppressive control Karen had wielded for years. At first, the changes were subtle. People began chatting outside, exchanging pleasantries, and there was a palpable shift in the energy around the neighborhood. It was as if a cloud had been lifted, and for the first time, the people of the community could truly breathe. Neighbors who had been afraid to challenge Karen started opening up. They shared stories of how she had made their lives difficult, how they had been too afraid to say anything when Karen had threatened fines for the smallest infractions, or how she'd manipulated her position to silence dissent. There was a sense of solidarity growing among us. We had all been victims of her need for control, but now we were united in our desire to rebuild. The HOA itself began to restructure. Karen's influence had poisoned everything, but with her gone, we had the opportunity to create a fairer, more transparent leadership structure. The board was replaced with people who were genuinely interested in maintaining the neighborhood's integrity without wielding power like a weapon. Decisions were made with input from the community, not just a select few who sought to enforce their will. The atmosphere shifted from one of fear to one of collaboration and trust. For me, the most important thing was the sense of peace that started to return to my home. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have to worry about Karen sending me another letter or coming to my door with another complaint. Harper and I were free to live without the constant stress that had been caused by Karen's interference. But even with that newfound peace, the loss of Max weighed heavily on my heart. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what had happened, how Karen's actions had irrevocably changed our lives. Max wasn't just a dog, he had been a constant companion, a protector, and a part of the family. There would always be an empty space where he once lay, his presence lingering in the corners of our home. The house felt quieter without him, and I knew Harper felt it too. Yet, in the midst of that grief, there was something that brought me comfort. Karen's reign of terror was over. She had crossed a line, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. Max had given us a voice, even in death. His senseless killing had been the catalyst that had exposed Karen for what she truly was, a bully, a manipulator, and someone who thought her power made her untouchable. But we had proven that no one, no matter how much power they held, could escape accountability. Harper was beginning to heal as well. She had been so affected by Max's death, the trauma of seeing him shot right in front of her, that I wasn't sure how long it would take her to process everything. But as the days went by, I saw a shift. Her laughter started to return, slowly at first. She spent more time outdoors again, playing in the yard and climbing the jungle gym at the park. We took walks together, just the two of us and the memories of Max, and although he would always be in our hearts, we learned to keep moving forward. Harper was stronger than I had given her credit for. She was healing, piece by piece, and it was a reminder that the resilience we had both shown during Karen's reign of terror wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, about finding hope even in the darkest of times. The community also began to heal. The relationships that Karen had fractured slowly started to mend. People who had been estranged by her manipulation began to reconnect, not out of fear, but out of a shared desire to create a better environment for everyone. There was no longer a sense of division, no longer a feeling of walking on eggshells when we spoke to each other. The trust had been broken by Karen, but it was being rebuilt by the very people she had tried to divide. Of course, the memory of Max would always remain with us. It was impossible to forget the way he had been taken from us so senselessly, so violently. But as the months passed, I began to see that Max had become more than just the victim of Karen's cruelty. He had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up against injustice, even when it seemed like the odds were against us. His memory would forever be a reminder of the strength it took to fight back, to never allow anyone to walk all over us. Harper and I visited the park often, and as we did, I noticed that she was starting to reclaim the spaces that had once been filled with fear and anxiety. The playground, once a site of trauma, was becoming a place of healing. Harper was no longer haunted by the shadows of that day. She was learning to take her joy back, step by step, as the weight of Karen's control was lifted from our lives. The process was slow, and the scars would always remain, but I saw in Harper's eyes that she was starting to remember what it felt like to be free, to feel safe again. As I stood there with Harper, watching her play in the park, I realized that despite everything we had gone through, we had come out on the other side stronger. Karen had tried to break us, but she hadn't succeeded. And we wouldn't let her. Max may have been gone, but his legacy, the legacy of standing up for what was right, was very much alive. We had honored his memory by taking back our lives, by reclaiming our peace. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. As the weeks turned into months, the change in the neighborhood was undeniable. Karen had been removed from her position as HOA president, and with her departure, the toxic grip she had held over the community began to fade. The legal action against her continued, but it became clear that the real victory was not just in seeing her face consequences for her actions, but in witnessing the transformation of the neighborhood itself. The once divided and fearful community was now coming together, finding strength in unity and solidarity. Neighbors who had long kept to themselves began to speak openly, sharing their frustrations with Karen and the oppressive atmosphere she had created. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and for the first time in years, the people who had been too afraid to speak out were finding their voice. The HOA, now restructured, focused on community well-being, fostering a sense of inclusivity and transparency that had been sorely lacking. There was no longer an unspoken fear of Karen's retribution, and as a result, people began to care more about one another, helping each other when needed, and working together to create a safer, more connected environment. In the midst of this newfound sense of unity, I found solace in knowing that Max's death had not been in vain. The pain of losing him would never fully disappear, but I could see his memory living on in the changes that were taking place. His tragic end had been the catalyst for exposing Karen's true nature, and it had forced the neighborhood to confront the toxicity that had festered under her rule. Max had been my companion, my protector, and in his death, he had unknowingly sparked a movement that freed us all from the fear and manipulation that had clouded our lives. As Harper continued to heal, I saw a shift in her as well. The shadows of Max's death still lingered, but her laughter was returning. She was playing outside again, without the hesitations that had once plagued her. She was finding joy in the simple things, reclaiming the life that Karen had tried to steal from us. The sight of her running through the yard, her eyes sparkling with the same energy I had seen in her before that day, brought a sense of peace I had thought was lost forever. I realized, too, that in fighting for Max, I had learned something about myself. I had faced down a bully, someone who had thought she could intimidate and control not only my family but an entire community. And I had stood my ground, not just for Max, but for Harper, for the neighborhood, and for the truth. I wasn't the same person I had been when Karen had first started her reign of terror. The fight had changed me, it had made me stronger, more resilient, and more aware of the power of standing up for what's right. The neighborhood was thriving again. It wasn't perfect, there would always be challenges to face, and there were still scars from the years of fear and manipulation, but there was a newfound sense of hope. People had learned to look out for one another, to speak up when something was wrong, and to never let anyone like Karen take away their voice again. The legacy of Max was alive in every conversation, every moment of connection, and every effort to rebuild a place of peace and safety. And as Harper and I sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that was finally free, I knew that Max would always be with us. His spirit, his love, and his loyalty had helped bring about the change we so desperately needed. He was gone, but his memory would forever be a beacon of the fight we had won, a fight for justice, for love, and for the right to live without fear. Karen may have taken Max from us, but she would never take away the lessons he taught us, nor the strength we had found in each other. Max's legacy would live on, not just in our hearts, but in the strength of a community that had learned to stand up, speak out, and never back down. And for that, I was forever grateful.